America and the world had a lesson to learn in Korea. Before 1945, nations sought to achieve complete and total victory in war. But the introduction of nuclear weapons and the incredible destructive power of modern conventional weapons made total war more dangerous than ever. The fact that tens of millions were killed in the first two world wars was horrifying. The possibility of nations fighting each other with nuclear weapons was a truly existential threat. The Korean War was the first example of a limited war and helped develop the strategies that the great nations would use in these struggles for decades to come. But a limited war means one thing for a nation and another for a soldier. The men who fought, bled, and died in the Korean War faced the same terrors and burdens that do all men in war. America would suffer almost 130,000 casualties, including over 36,000 killed in this conflict that would eventually be called the Forgotten War. Forgotten. Limited. But not for the men in combat. They fought as hard as Americans had in any other war. They also saw heroes rise among them, as in generations past. Men who laid down their lives so that their comrades might live. Men who charged into a swarm of enemies and who often did not survive. Men whose sacrifice and valor went above and beyond the call of duty. These are the stories of the Medal of Honor. Over the past several decades, and particularly after World War II, the Medal of Honor has taken on ever more prestige. The criteria for actions earning the medal had grown more stringent. Also, additional medals were created to recognize valor and service that were worthy of distinction, but not rising to the level of the Medal of Honor. The Medal of Honor sits at the top of a pyramid of honor, encompassing the various awards for valor. Second only to the Medal of Honor are the Distinguished Service Cross, the Navy Cross, and the Air Force Cross. The Distinguished Service Cross was created for the Army in 1918, and the Navy Cross a year later for the Navy and Marines. In 1960, the Air Force Cross would be created for that branch of service. The Silver Star is the third highest military award designated solely for heroism in combat. It was also created in 1918. The Distinguished Flying Cross may be awarded to anyone in the military who distinguishes himself through heroism or outstanding achievement while in aerial flight. The Valor device or V device, is added to the Distinguished Flying Cross to represent valor in combat. In 1944, the Bronze Star was authorized for all branches of the military. It can be awarded for either combat heroism or for meritorious service. Again, the Valor device is added to the Bronze Star for actions of combat heroism. The Bronze Star with the Valor device is the fourth highest award for valor. Each branch of service also awards its own medal to service members who distinguish themselves through heroism not involving direct conflict with the enemy. They rank above the Bronze Star, but are not medals of combat valor. They include the Army's Soldier's Medal, established in 1926, the Navy and Marine Corps Medal, established in 1942, and the Airmen's Medal, established in 1960. These awards, and other awards that do not necessarily involve heroism or gallantry in action, serve to provide recognition of superior service and action. They therefore allow the Medal of Honor to be reserved for actions truly above and beyond the call of duty. Some of these awards were added during World War II, effectively raising the prestige of the nation's highest award for combat valor even higher. World War II had barely ended before the Cold War began. The Soviet Union and the United States faced each other as the world's only two superpowers, and their ideological differences made military conflict seem inevitable. But in those early years, though the tension was palpable, the extent of the Soviet threat was not yet clear. What was clear was the enormous cost of maintaining a large, well-equipped, well-trained army. In 1945, defense spending was almost 90% of the total spending by the federal government, up from 18% in 1940. More than the financial burden was the desire of the public, the Congress, and the troops themselves to bring our boys home. The Army released half of its 8 million soldiers before the end of 1945. When the Army slowed its demobilization in order to meet the new overseas responsibilities thrust upon it by the war, the public and the troops balked. There were troop demonstrations at bases in the Philippines, China, England, France, Germany, Hawaii, and even California. The Army cut its force in half again during the first 6 months of 1946. Budget cuts reduced the forces further, and by June 1947, the Army consisted of fewer than 700,000 ground troops and 300,000 airmen. Though this was still sizable for a peacetime army, the loss of personnel meant fewer equipment and maintenance specialists, and equipment deteriorated rapidly. Meanwhile, the country of Korea was coming out from under 40 years of control by Imperial Japan. After the war, Korea was wrested from Japan's control by the Allies. But this did not mean freedom for Korea. The nation was split in half at the 38th parallel. The Soviets dominated the northern half. In the south, the U.S. maintained a small number of military advisors. Korea had seen struggles between communists and nationalist forces for years. Many communist Koreans had helped Mao Zedong's communist forces during the Chinese Civil War. That long conflict had subsided during China's war with Japan, which had merged with World War II. Soon after Japan's defeat, China's internal divisions exploded into a full-scale civil war. By 1950, the major battles of the Civil War were over. The Communist People's Republic of China, or PRC, controlled mainland China. The PRC signed a treaty with the Soviet Union in February 1950, obliging each country to assist the other if attacked by a third party. This was just about the time that the communist leader of North Korea, Kim Il-sung, sought and received Soviet and Chinese approval in an invasion of South Korea. Approval was given, and on June 25, 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea. Both the U.S. and the Republic of Korea were surprised and unprepared for this attack. But President Truman didn't hesitate in his response. To ignore the communist aggression in Korea would be to repeat the mistakes of the appeasement of Hitler in the 1930s. The U.S. first went to the United Nations. The Soviet Union had been boycotting the Security Council for months. Without the Soviet veto to obstruct their efforts, the Americans were able to convince the Security Council to establish a United Nations Command, or UNC, to defend South Korea under the leadership of the U.S. General Douglas MacArthur, Medal of Honor recipient from World War II, was appointed commander of UN forces. But before the UN forces could organize and respond, North Korea captured and controlled most of South Korea. By June 28th, North Korea had captured the capital city, Seoul, and South Korea's army had been completely routed, pushed back to the Pusan perimeter in the southeast. General MacArthur planned a bold and brilliant amphibious assault at Incheon to take back the south. Incheon was the port for Seoul, 18 miles inland, and was the closest possible landing site to the capital and the communication center there.
The history of war proves that 9 out of 10 times an army has been destroyed because its supply lines have been cut off. We shall land at Incheon, and I shall crush them.
The Joint Chiefs in Washington were doubtful of his plan, but MacArthur's gamble paid off. The daring assault was a tremendous success. By September 23rd, the North Koreans were in retreat from the Pusan perimeter. And on September 29th, 1950, MacArthur reported,
"By the grace of a merciful providence, our forces, fighting under the standard of that greatest hope and inspiration of mankind, the United Nations, have liberated this ancient city of Seoul."
The Incheon offensive succeeded in driving the North Koreans back across the 38th parallel. But this decisive victory unsettled the Soviet Union and China, who increased their support for North Korea. Mao Zedong dispatched an expeditionary force called the Chinese People's Volunteer Force across the Yalu River into North Korea. These forces were highly skilled in camouflage. Hundreds of Chinese units had moved into North Korea without detection, until the first Chinese soldier was discovered among captives taken on October 25th. At first, it appeared that individual Chinese soldiers, possibly volunteers, had reinforced the North Koreans. But in late November, attacks by all Chinese forces hammered units of the United Nations Command. The Soviets provided air support for any battles in communist territory. UNC forces in North Korea began to fold, and MacArthur ordered a withdrawal. MacArthur informed Washington,
"We face an entirely new war."
And that war dragged on. On May 31st, 1951, a platoon from the 187th Airborne Regimental Combat Team was in a defensive position on Hill 420 near Wongtong-ni. They were taking heavy fire from enemy artillery, mortars, and machine guns. The platoon was outnumbered and outgunned, and they were taking heavy casualties, including Corporal Rudolfo Hernandez, wounded by grenade fragments and artillery shrapnel. Low on ammunition, the platoon was forced to withdraw. Corporal Hernandez was bleeding heavily and chose to remain behind to slow down the enemy. A cartridge in his rifle ruptured, jamming it. Hernandez fixed his bayonet to his rifle, hurled his remaining grenades into the enemy, and then charged out of his foxhole. Armed only with an inoperable rifle and bayonet, Hernandez rushed the enemy. He was able to kill 6 before bayonet strikes, bullet wounds, and shrapnel damage that ripped away part of his skull took their toll. He collapsed, unconscious. But his decisive, valorous act had halted the enemy advance long enough for his platoon to organize a counterattack and retake lost ground. Corporal Hernandez's wounds were severe. A large part of his skull and part of his brain were missing. He had taken a bayonet in the back and in the face. He was so far gone that he was placed into a body bag. But a medic saw his hand move and realized that Hernandez was still alive. Hernandez had suffered terrible wounds. He described his recovery in an interview with Helen Ross, herself the wife of a Medal of Honor winner from the attack on Pearl Harbor.
When I came to, I was unable to move my arms or legs. Tubes and bottles suspended over my bed should have told me that I was being fed intravenously. But I knew nothing, understood nothing. I didn't know what I wanted or needed. I didn't even realize at first that I was paralyzed. I lay there looking around, drifting in and out. I don't remember much about that hospital or the next one in Japan where I stayed until the middle of July, 1.5 months after the action. Just learning to eat was a struggle. I couldn't swallow. Nurses urged me on, but I couldn't get anything down, not a drop. Then when they brought in ice cream, it was sheer torture to almost taste it. But I couldn't even get my lips open. One afternoon, there came this most precious Japanese girl. I took a good look at her and thought, and that's as far as I got. When I thought, my chin dropped down and my mouth fell open. At that very moment, she popped a tiny spoonful of ice cream into my mouth. Pretty soon, I was eating everything that anyone would bring to me.
Hernandez underwent years of hospitalization and rehabilitative care. He had to relearn how to speak, read, walk, and even swallow. But with the indomitable will and courage he had shown in combat, Rudolfo Hernandez struggled through and persevered. He was presented the Medal of Honor on April 12, 1952, by President Truman. 2 days after Corporal Hernandez helped reverse the assault on Hill 420, the 24th Infantry Regiment of the 25th Infantry Division was fighting near Chipori, northeast of Seoul. The 24th Regiment had the distinction of being the last all-black regiment in operation. Truman had ordered the desegregation of the military in 1948, but that process took several years to complete. These men were the last of the Buffalo Soldiers. On June 2nd, 1951, Sergeant Cornelius Charlton's unit was attempting to take Hill 543, and they were facing fierce resistance. In the first charge up the hill, Charlton's white commanding officer was wounded and evacuated. Sergeant Charlton assumed command and rallied his men for another assault. He led the second charge up the hill. Using his rifle and grenades, Charlton personally eliminated 2 hostile positions and killed 6 of the enemy in that charge. But his platoon was taking heavy casualties, and they were again pinned down. Charlton regrouped his men and led them forward again, only to be knocked back by a wave of grenades. Charlton was wounded in the chest by grenade fragments. Refusing medical aid, he led a third charge up the hill, taking the crest of the ridge. Private First Class Ronald Holmes described what he saw that day.
He got the rest of the men together and we started for the top. The enemy had some good emplacements. We couldn't get to them. Grenades kept coming at us and we were chased back down. Again, we tried, but no luck. Sergeant Charlton said he was going to make it this time and he yelled, "Let's go!" And we started up again. We reached the top this time.
When Charlton reached the crest, he saw that one enemy emplacement remained on the reverse slope. That one enemy position had taken out so many of Charlton's men, and it could still take out many more.
I saw the sergeant go over the top and charge a bunker on the other side.
Alone, Charlton charged the enemy position. He was struck by shrapnel from another grenade, but he managed to strafe the enemy with devastating rifle fire. The last of the defenders were routed, and the hill belonged to Charlton's men. Sergeant Cornelius Charlton did not survive the wounds he took in gaining that hill. He received the Medal of Honor posthumously. The 31st Infantry Regiment of the 7th Division arrived in Korea for MacArthur's bold strike in the Battle of Incheon. It was their first battle since surrendering to Imperial Japan at Bataan in World War II. They successfully captured Suwon in that offensive and participated in major battles throughout the Korean War. They suffered over 700 casualties in the week-long battle at the Chosin Reservoir. There were over 500 casualties during almost 3 weeks of fighting near the Hwachon Reservoir. But the single most costly day for the 31st Regiment was October 14th, 1952. They were part of the 7th Division's assault on Triangle Hill, which was held by a battalion of one of China's elite armies. The enemy was dug in and ready to fight. On that first day of fighting alone, the 31st Regiment took over 400 casualties. On that day, First Lieutenant Edward Showalter commanded the regiment's Company A, which had been selected to spearhead an assault on a set of twin peaks nicknamed Jane Russell Hill. His company's first platoon was attacking a key approach to the hill when they came under heavy, vicious small arms, grenade, and mortar fire. They were just 50 yards short of the enemy's strong point, but they could not move any further, and they were taking casualties. Lieutenant Showalter led his second platoon in to support the first, and as they neared the objective, he was severely wounded in the side by a grenade fragment. He refused medical aid, instead leading his men into the trenches where they began routing the enemy from the bunkers with grenades. Suddenly, sniper fire struck Showalter's helmet. The bullet lodged in his right ear, between the skin and bone. Lieutenant Showalter was knocked unconscious, but awoke again soon after. He shrugged off the medics seeking to attend him and rushed back into the fight. He retained command and remained at the front of his troops and continued issuing orders and encouraging his men. Wounded again from more shrapnel, he continued to refuse medical aid until the objective was secured. Finally, with the Chinese soldiers in retreat, he was evacuated. 4 months later, he received the Medal of Honor from President Dwight Eisenhower. Edward Showalter remained with the Army until 1977, when he retired as a colonel. He served 2 combat tours in Vietnam and was awarded the Silver Star for actions there. When asked about his Medal of Honor, Edward Showalter replied,
I always figured I was awarded the medal as the representative of a superb fighting team. We took that hill together. I wear the Medal of Honor on behalf of all the men who fought and died on that hill. It's really theirs.
Not every soldier is recognized for his heroic actions. Indeed, one of the countless tragedies of war is that the bodies of many soldiers are never even identified. On August 3rd, 1956, 3 years after the end of the Korean War, President Dwight D. Eisenhower signed a bill to select and pay tribute to the unknown soldiers of the Korean War and World War II. These soldiers would be buried in the Tomb of the Unknowns at Arlington National Cemetery. The Tomb of the Unknowns was created in response to the mass casualties of World War I. The idea of honoring the unknown dead, of which there were so many in World War I, began in Great Britain in 1920. Then, in March 1921, the U.S. Congress approved a plan to return the body of an unknown American soldier from the war and bury him with full honors in a tomb to be constructed at the Memorial Amphitheater in Arlington National Cemetery. On Memorial Day, 1921, 4 unknown soldiers were exhumed from 4 World War I American cemeteries in France. They were placed in 4 identical caskets and set before a highly decorated veteran of that war, U.S. Army Sergeant Edward F. Younger. Sergeant Younger ceremonially selected 1 casket. He later spoke of his decision.
I was left alone in the chapel. There were 4 coffins, all unmarked and unnamed. The one that I placed the roses on would be the one brought home and placed in the National Shrine. I walked around the coffins 3 times. Then suddenly I stopped. What caused me to stop, I don't know. It was as though something had pulled me. I placed the roses on the coffin in front of me. I can still remember the odd feeling that I had, standing there alone.
The chosen unknown was transported to the United States aboard the USS Olympia. Those remaining were interred in the Meuse-Argonne Cemetery, France. The selected unknown lay in state at the Capitol Rotunda until midnight on November 10th, 1921. On November 11th, Armistice Day, the casket of that unknown soldier was carried from the Rotunda to Arlington National Cemetery under a military escort. Behind the caisson bearing the flag-draped casket walked President Harding, Vice President Coolidge, Chief Justice Taft, and the other justices of the Supreme Court, members of the Cabinet, Senate, and House of Representatives, generals and other distinguished officers from America's wars, and recipients of the Medal of Honor. President Harding officiated at the interment ceremonies at the Memorial Amphitheater at Arlington National Cemetery. He conferred upon the unknown soldier the Medal of Honor and the Distinguished Service Cross. Representatives of foreign governments allied with the U.S. in World War I participated as well, bestowing upon the unknown their own highest military awards. The United States reciprocated this gesture, honoring an unknown soldier from nations of France, Great Britain, Belgium, Italy, and Romania with the Medal of Honor. In the history of the Medal of Honor, these are the only 5 instances in which the award was presented to a foreign soldier. After World War II, plans were made for the selection and burial of an unknown from that war. But fighting in Korea broke out before the selection process had begun, and the decision was made to postpone until a more appropriate time. That time turned out to be 1958, when unknowns from World War II and the Korean War were selected for burial in the Tomb of the Unknowns. The final selection of the unknown from the Korean War took place on May 15, 1958. All of the unknown war dead from that war had been buried in the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific. In that place, 4 candidates for burial in the Tomb of the Unknowns were placed in identical caskets, draped with American flags. Master Sergeant Ned Lyle, a recipient of the Distinguished Service Cross for heroic action in Korea, was designated to make the final selection. He placed a wreath of blue and white carnations on one casket and saluted the remains of the soldier inside. The selection of the World War II unknown took place 11 days later aboard the USS Canberra. Earlier stages of the selection process had resulted in 1 remaining candidate from the European Theater of Operations and 1 candidate from the Pacific Theater. Hospital Corpsman First Class William R. Charette, recipient of the Medal of Honor for actions in the Korean War, made the final selection. The selected unknown, along with the unknown from the Korean War, arrived in Washington on May 28, 1958. They lay in state in the Capitol Rotunda until 1 p.m. on May 30th. As the procession moved toward Arlington National Cemetery, the 2 caissons, each carrying 1 unknown, traveled side by side. When they reached the cemetery, they shifted into a column led by the caisson bearing the World War II unknown soldier. As the caissons entered the cemetery, 20 jet fighters and bombers passed overhead, with 1 plane missing from each formation. The casket of the World War II unknown soldier was placed in front of President Eisenhower, and the Korean War unknown soldier in front of Vice President Nixon. The Marine Band played the national anthem, and then a bugler sounded attention 3 times. After a long moment of silence, President Eisenhower placed a Medal of Honor on each casket. The unknowns of World War II and the Korean War were interred in the plaza beside their World War I comrade. The tomb sarcophagus was placed above the grave of the unknown soldier of World War I in April 1931. The sarcophagus is constructed of 7 rectangular pieces of white marble, together weighing 79 tons. On the west panel of the sarcophagus, facing the amphitheater, are the words, "Here rests, in honored glory, an American soldier, known but to God." On the east panel, facing the Capitol, 3 Greek figures have been sculpted. On the left stands Peace, holding a dove in one hand. On the right stands Valor, bearing a broken sword in his hands. In the center stands Victory, holding hands with Peace while extending an olive branch to Valor. The north and south panels present a total of 6 inverted wreaths, each representing a major campaign of World War I. West of the sarcophagus are the crypts of unknowns from World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. Those 3 graves are marked with white marble slabs that lie flush with the plaza. Since April 6, 1948, the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier has been guarded 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, regardless of weather. In blazing sun, freezing snow, and even in the face of hurricanes, the sentinels continue their watch. The sentinels, members of the 3rd Infantry, or Old Guard, are famous for the precision of their march and changing of the guard. The sentinel marches 21 steps across a black mat, past the crypts of each unknown. He then makes a crisp 90-degree turn to face east for 21 seconds. He then makes another 90-degree turn, facing north for 21 seconds. A crisp shoulder arms movement places the rifle on the shoulder nearest the visitors to signify that the sentinel stands between the tomb and any threat. After that moment, the sentinel paces 21 steps north, turns, and repeats the process. Every hour during the winter and every half hour during summer daylight hours, the sentinels conduct the changing of the guard ceremony. As the new sentinel approaches the relief commander, slowly and with great precision, conducts a white glove inspection of the sentinel's weapon. The two then march to the center of the mat, where the active sentinel stops his walk, and all three men salute the tomb. The relief commander instructs the active sentinel, "Pass on your orders." The sentinel replies, "Post and orders remain as directed." The relieving sentinel responds, "Orders acknowledged." The relieving sentinel then steps into position at the center of the black mat. The relief commander and relieved sentinel exit, and the new sentinel begins his march. The unknown soldiers serve to remind us that not all actions of valor are witnessed and recorded in war. We do not know the stories of these men, but we know they gave their lives in a war they did not start to protect the freedom of people who would never know their names. They demonstrate the courage and heroism of every man and woman who goes into combat in service of their nation. The individual stories that we know of men like Showalter, Charlton, and Hernandez are an inspiration to the everyday heroes in uniform. They are a reminder that some among us will lay down their lives for their comrades. They will face threats we can hardly imagine in an attempt to eliminate the dangers that are posed to the men in the trench beside them. These are the stories of the Medal of Honor.